Welcome to episode 6 of Capturing the Intangibles podcast. This week, we're dissecting another buzzword in the software industry with robotic process automation, or RPA, and debating the hype in future runway with hyperautomation. Spoiler alert, I'm not exactly a fan of broad usage of marketing terms. Hey guys, welcome back to the show this week. How are you guys doing today?
Really good.
Yeah, not bad, Rick. Pretty good.
And you?
I'm hanging in there, but all good. So we discussed a couple of topics that actually we have a whole host of 20, 30 topics that we want to get to at some point in time. But Mike and I yesterday spoke a little bit. We were going to go dive back into big data and some of the insights that we can get from that, and maybe even start to talk about what does it mean between having everything in one cloud or the shared cloud scenario or multi-cloud scenario. We're going to do that at a later time because we thought today was a great day to maybe hit on, let's say, a term that is still feels like it's up and coming or popular, but we're going to call this show Robotic Process Automation, or RPA, Hyperautomation, or insert new buzzword here, right? So I think this is going to be a fun show to where we're going to have some different perspectives on how we feel about RPA. What does it really mean? What are we actually trying to do? Is it something real? Is it something not? Is it something old? Is it something new? So we really just wanted to have sort of a thought leadership and general feelings on what we think about the technology and how we can use it. So let's kick things off on just defining what RPA really means to us. And Massimo, let me start with you. What does RPA really mean to you?
Well, at the end of the day, for me, it's just automation. Just all good school automation. And that's what, we work in IT to really enable automation. That's all. Nothing fancy, nothing big. It's all about automation. But
so what about the robotic term?
Yeah, but now people says, well, what if the software can learn about that automation and become smarter and smarter, and the automation and the decision behind the automations are smarter and smarter? That's the dimension of the RPA robotic. I mean, robotic is just a robot or someone in the background doing something. But at the end of the day, it talks about being smart on the decision. It's not just copying file and having a routine that copies files every time from a directory to another. That's an automation. I mean, I'm running Macs for years. There is this automator program in Macs for folks that runs in Macs, which you really, really can build automations in the background. But those are built, to do always the repetitive things, like a QA scripts that, test this form or this API, if it works or not. It always does the same. With the robotic, or I would say more intelligence, you need that intelligence to make those tasks not only repetitive, but, the decisions are smart behind. And probably Mike works on big data. The big data is going to love about the intelligence side of, automation, right?
Well, yeah, that's a hyper automation part. But I agree with you, because if integration is really tying together business applications through business processes, then RPA is something like, a discrete process that if I'm someone in finance, processing receivables, I don't want to click the same 16, 17 buttons in a row to receive, an invoice or receive a product or what have you. I want to be able to automate those types of steps, because there's no value in that. It's just simply busy work. And so the job needs to be done, but it is counter to being productive. You can't fairly measure a person on how many receivables they've done in a day when all they're doing is just looking at a list of these are the same 17 buttons that I need to click to process, X number of lines. So, that's where RPA comes in and solves for, I think, that discrete sort of tediousness of being able to solve for, kind of similar to integration for software, but automating the actual process, the things that people actually have to do that they otherwise, their wrist cramps after having to do all day long, 5 days a week. But I can hear your enthusiasm for RPA, Massimo.
Yeah, and I know that. And, Rick actually is very enthusiastic RPA. Every time we talk about it, it starts to really you feel, you see and feel it like, ooh, he's scared or not scared, but it's like, what's new on RPA, right? So
he gets so upset that his hair turns red.
Yeah. Oh no, losing air more. I think losing air, which you can see,
well,
already.
It's starting to turn like silver a little bit with the gray coming in just as a part of this conversation. But hey, it's going to be no surprise to you guys. I'm extremely negative's not the right word. I just wish that when we would talk about RPA in general, that we would provide more depth and substance to what we actually mean. So that's why I asked, what does RPA really mean? What does robotic really mean? Because I think the natural inclination is, because we throw robotic in front of process automation, which has been around for a long, long time, that we automatically assume that it's AI, and it's really not, in my opinion. And then we can get into a broader discussion of what is AI. Is AI more than ML, or is it just any sort of quote robotic type things? But that's not really the discussion. I totally see the value in, Mike, you're talking about the manual labor of, if I need to get something from Excel and throw it into my software systems, and I don't want to do that sort of tedious task. It makes total sense. It's a quick win scenario. I would argue that even those types of utilities have some tools in place to where you can do that automatically without what I'm going to define as traditional RPA, which is the screen scraping technology that's all the rage right now, to say, hey, I want to go to this web page. I want to go to this separate system. I want to put it into my legacy green screen system, or whatever it may be. Yeah, there is a ton of value there. But where I get caught up in this is it really solving for where technology needs to evolve? And should we really be talking more about mature systems? Or is that just something that we're still too new on? And when I say mature systems, I'm talking about those ERPs or those applications that are all API enabled to the point to where we can back in, orchestrate, and automate a lot of these things. That's how I sort of define robotic process automation. But the industry refers to it as traditional RPA. But hence the title. That's where, Massimo, you were talking about this yesterday with me. Is now you see maybe like OCR or capture type vendors start to claim these sort of terminologies too, which is still a little bit different. So I just have certain feelings about when I talk to CIOs or customers or whoever, or you guys. I'm negative on just calling things RPA. I want to be very specific. What is traditional RPA? What is now hyper automation? And what is beyond that? And I think that's where we're going to get in this conversation. But Massimo, maybe you want to hit a little bit on, what you think about how it's evolved into maybe the document capture space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at we have the board here today back, there is a clash, going on. And to be honest, I mean, the RPA vendors and the evaluation of all this company, they've done a phenomenal job to create, and hype and a space on that. But at the end of the day, they played a good game on a gap that was there, that probably other vendors couldn't really solve or didn't really pay attention to that at all. So if you look at, pure from a technology perspective, you have RPA vendors, right? That they started really with UI scraping technologies. So they will go to legacy system. They will have a very low level entry of training a system and going from one screen to the other, and they will record that activity, and then they will execute that activity. But if you take a look at on the real technologies, these technologies were already available for decades, right? And so if you are an RPA vendor, you will play in this space. If you are a middleware or a workflow vendor, you probably had orchestrations engines, workflow engines, right? So those are really very sophisticated technologies, and they can go call APIs, generate event, orchestrate a flow between a system and a human. You can, go define it. But the real issues here, you need, this is really IT owned. That's really the issue. You had someone in IT to go and define things. While RPA vendors, where they have been very successful, you had a business user almost, capable to record an activity and repeat that for yourself, or for your colleagues. That's where they won a lot. But at the end of the day, the sophistication that you have in this world, that's what you want to have, because this is a full automated, full transactional, full security proof, right? And this is your future technology. And that's what we're seeing, that now this type of capabilities are winning. And what you see now, vendors essentially saying, well, can we bring this not only IT owned, but can we have, can we abstract this technology in such a way that the business users can define and those type of activities without the need of IT, right? That's really what, and I'm not even touching based on the AI and the learning aspect. We're going to go into a moment, but that's actually the clash that we are seeing, because at the end of the day, UI scraping is a technology, like I said, that exists already in a long time. But if your application or your applications that you are trying to activate or automate, you're doing with UI scraping, while those applications really are sophisticated enough with good APIs, with good workflows, with good task-oriented activities and processes, with good events and event-driven architecture, why would you go for UI scraping where you with this technology you can do everything? The only issue is, you need someone in IT, and the business owner cannot do it.
Right. And don't you think, Massimo, that that's where like the traditional RPA vendors are starting to progress too?
Mm-hmm.
Like you see their business model starting to evolve, because the left-hand side that we're seeing here with traditional RPA, I mean, we talk with analysts all the time, and how it's still a very marketable area, but it's a short-term win and gain. So you have to be able to traverse those, which is maybe when we're starting to get into this hyper automation concept, right?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And that's where we start to work with customers, like Mike was saying, your invoice matching, your payment matching, or even your expense approvals, right? So you can record a UI scraping and then learning how Massimo is approving expenses. But what you want is really the real sophistication, reusing the business logic, reusing the same transaction management, the same security, and so on. That sophistication brings your RPA to the next level. And again, I'm not even talking about that learning how Massimo is choosing between, hotels, airfare, or customer entertainment, category in an expense management situation. So to me, it's really, at the end of the day, you ask me, what is about RPA? It's all about automation, but done in a very good way,
Yeah. And I don't want to be naive here either, because I think we all understand how difficult it is to move some of these legacy applications that may not have these capabilities, especially in a larger organization. I totally understand that's difficult to do. So sometimes you have to sacrifice and say, well, I'm going to have these short-term wins as I transition this. But I think where we're at now with this sort of debate is maybe it's more like a chicken and egg. Which one comes first? Can I do them in conjunction? So it's not necessarily to debate the validity of traditional RPA. It's just that, I mean, from my perspective, if I was making software decisions, which I am to a certain degree, I would argue that I want to uplift to more modern architectures to facilitate this long term. But I obviously do realize that there is some short-term benefits, because that is such a time-consuming thing, right? So I think we need to call that out. That's clearly a definitive area. But as we get more progressive, Mike, I'd like for you to maybe talk on how you define hyper-automation. So now that we're getting beyond maybe even the middleware, how would you define what this hyper-automation theme is? And how does it play in with data and all these other topics?
Yeah, so that's actually it ties into what you were just saying a second ago, because let's say, I'm in the market for a nice sleek piece of RPA software to automate a bunch of data entry analyst jobs, or, a subset of workloads or workflows that my enterprise users in the ERP have to work on every single day. It might be a quick win to get some RPA in place, build out that rules engine, connect that to screen scraping software, and then job done. But does that have a shelf life, 5 years from now? How do you evolve or grow that, or actually make that keep generating new types of ROI beyond just simply extending your RPA investments to, automate more types of workflows, which can be certainly valuable. But I think what it hinges on is also the fact that, well, it's very, very procedurally based, right? You're recording a series of steps that
Mhm.
is defined by an application or a vendor or a user, and there's no deviating from that whatsoever. So I might call an API to get some inputs from some third party web resource, and then blend that with adding that to a description to some notes on an invoice document or something of that sort. That's easy to reproduce over and over again. I think where hyper automation starts to take you is when you start to weave in those types of screen scraping and automation software, and you're able to start blending that into machine learning models. That actually starts to get a little bit more interesting, because now not only are you automating a fairly repetitive, very tedious process, now you can start to bake in new types of handling and evolution on how you actually process through these workflows. So you can reduce the amount of errors encountered, so that you can reduce the amount of oversight that's required on a lot of this automation, because otherwise you're simply having to build in rules and if then statements for every single condition that's ever going to exist in your enterprise. And there's always going to be one other thing that you didn't think of, or one other thing that your software didn't account for, and it breaks down. And so being able to actually start capturing data that's circulating from the ERP, number one, and actually landing into something like a big data platform that you can train your models, yeah, that has predictive value when you're actually doing general workflow capabilities in an ERP, like order to cash. But actually, how do you actually close out that order to cash scenario with data processing in the actual ERP screens that may cover 3 or 4 screens? You need to call 5 or 6 resources, and you need to start embedding in some sort of intelligence into that workflow. I think it's really a combination of data coming together, machine learning coming together, that's feeding off of general activities in the enterprise, and then feeding that into the RPA models, so that it's no longer just simply my robots off doing the same thing, right? So
Yeah.
otherwise, you would have a Roomba without any sort of AI is just simply going to do the same perimeter every single day, and it has no idea whether or not that spot is clean. But by adding
Yeah.
automation in here, yeah. So
Very
go ahead,
good.
Masma. Yeah.
Yeah, very good point, Mike. Actually, if you take a look at how we make it intelligence, right? So let's say you have a business app or multiple, right? Let's say that you're doing financial, so invoice matching or payment, matching. If you want to learn how Massimo does that and decide if an invoice can get matched or not, and most of the time it's the exceptions, right? How to deal with the exception. If everything is fine, he's got invoices get matched and it's not a problem, right? It's all about the exception. So you need data, Mike. And we talked about in different podcasts already that the need of a data lake where you have data about the invoices, payment, vendors, banks, you have all this type of data. That's really good. The other data that we really need is, the software usage, right? So the usage, what is a user like Massimo or is someone in his or department look at most of the time in this exception. So what are the things that are always look like for, okay, I need to take care of this, or I'm gonna manually match this invoice in this way because of this exception, and the next time the robot can do it itself, right? So it's a blend of the real transaction, the real data, the blend of usage, but there is another dimension that people don't realize that is very important. In data lakes, there are services like GRC services, right? And the GRC services also take advantage of the data of the data lake with all the transaction, but it does it more in a global perspective of all the data and all the domains. And so in-house also gives a suggestion how you make Massimo makes a decision. It has to be in a compliant way. So there is a suggestion and a suggestion how to do it in such a way there is no fraud as well. So one of the things that a lot of vendors do not talk about, RPA vendors, is how a robot makes a decision, where it's based on. And I'm not talking about logging that a robot A has made this decision, but how can you prove that this decision was done in a compliant way and monitor that decision that a robot didn't really actually make an incompliant decision, right? So that's another data set that can be added to this decision making robot and makes a lot of value for the companies.
Yeah, so governance, risk, and compliance for those joining us here is what we mean by GRC, and it's interesting because now it's not just the individual users; it's that oversight to say, "Hey, is my system doing something I can trust?" So maybe it's bleeding into that trustworthy AI type concept. But I see two things here, and I want to kind of define these because it fits with your diagram here, Massimo. Is that Mike, you and I have done separate podcasts with other individuals on IPA, intelligent process automation, right? And we've always defined it as, you take a systematic. This is something we hold dear to sort of our architectural views, but we take systematic workflows. We have that event data in the data lake, and now we can find the trends and the best practices of how we've interacted with that data. Now we can insert a machine learning model in the actual workflow that existed previously, and now we've made that more intelligent. So I can augment a user by saying, here's what ML insights is predicting or suggesting you to do. You can still choose to whether I want to do something with that or not. Or once I trust that, I can completely automate it. But to Massimo, your point, that's just one area of the data.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how we define sort of IPA. And maybe it's growing, but also we talk a lot about these self-adjusting or self-healing workflow type things
Yeah.
too. That's another data set that goes into the data lake to say, hey, I've got this requisition automation practice that has been running for forever, right, or several years. But I'm starting to notice something in the data of how that workflow performs, and maybe this is starting to blend into GRC to where I'm noticing a trend to where maybe that workflow itself, that orchestration, changes itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? So not necessarily the event data from the first point, but the actual data of how that workflow is processing and how can we optimize those two. So you can go into so many different layers. The key here is that to get there, you have to be on a modern architecture.
Exactly.
Because it's very hard to get that sort of insights on, say, a green screen system or whatever legacy application may be running, to where I can't systematically influence things. There's always going to be a manual intervention. It's always going to be hard to get access to the data. It's always going to be hard to aggregate and correlate the data across modern systems against something that's legacy. So I think that's where I don't hate RPA. I want to make that very clear. It serves a very clear need, but to get to this sort of depth that we're talking about now, the prerequisite is a modern architecture across the ecosystem, period.
Exactly. And it goes back on the previous podcast, about, the wirings, right? So you need also all this wiring. Once you have all this wiring done, RPA becomes very strategic to you, because then you can focus on the good things. Well, if you do just point to point, some screen scraping, recording some activities, that's just departmental tactical work, right? It doesn't say anything from a company perspective how much automation you're doing. And so if you have a platform for innovation where everything is wired, now you're going to have RPA for your entire company and enterprise, and give really that automation to not only just one department, but to all the departments, right? So that's very, very important.
I think if you actually flip it on its head, I think actually it makes it an even stronger point. If you don't do that, Rick, you're saying a modern architecture, but if you don't actually do that, then what you're stuck, or what you're left with, is actually building everything that should be common technology and innovation for the entire enterprise. You're stuck actually building all that logic into an RPA platform. And you're completely
Yeah.
siloing all that value into an RPA product. And RPA is not going to do integration for you. It's not going to be doing workflow exception handling for you, notifications, governance, risk, and mitigation compliance strategies. It can't do any of that. Or if you're going to
Or
bake
even
in
machine
all that
learning.
solutions, yeah, like you can't build all of that into RPA and then that is your bet for the future of how the company grows. RPA has to complement bigger innovation strategies and bets that you're making. So it needs to be woven into that existing modern architecture. And actually, I'm kind of curious, Rick, you said a few times modern architecture, but like, can you put a point on it? Like, what is a modern architecture when you actually say that, and how RPA actually complements it? Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I just mean, can I systematically have interactions built very easily with my systems to where I don't have to do something so manually, or I have to do some sort of custom coding to the level of which I'm not interacting with something with like an API, for instance, right? So that's what we really mean. This whole concepts of, you can bring in a lot of things here, microservices, containers with multi-cloud, just having that sort of flexibility to where the UI is not so much of a concern. And I have all the flexibility in the world as, of course, an IT admin, but Massimo hit on earlier how we're trying to get even more abstraction away from that for business users to interact with. That's what I mean. Not so stuck into the standards at which the system requires me to do something. I have much more flexibility because the back end is a whole lot more modern. So that's what I fundamentally mean by that. But I think, Mike, what you said, it's the inflection point here, and lots of companies are at different maturity levels with this. But I think to me, I think it boils down to, are you looking for operational efficiencies or are you looking for net new opportunities? Because net new opportunities, when you look at the insights that come from your data and how I can then put that into my systems, that to me feels more like the intelligent process automation and the modern workflow space rather than RPA. And RPA is still kind of stuck in that sort of efficiency space. And efficiency is great, but everyone can get efficiencies with a lot of these tools. Isn't it more interesting to find out what sort of power exists in my data and my processes, and then insert that into the business very quickly and easily? And I think that plays into what I mean by these modern architectures.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is more for the tech guys, I would say, or the geeky guys, is if your application is built with an API first, an API first idea. So you say, I have, backends or microservices, and they can be exposed through a gateway, API gateway. If they are, exposed, not only the data, but the activities, the processes through an API, essentially you already have the enablement for RPA, because you can attach any orchestration engine. And then since your microservice has those APIs, then you can orchestrate whatever automation you want, right? And then if you attach a data lake with a machine learning capability, then you have the learning side, right? The only thing that people do not talk again on RPA, which is a new dimension, I want you guys your opinion, is the UX side, right? How does RPA gets to the end user? I'm not only talking about the recording side, because I can push a menu button and there is some recording and then I'll record, whatever orchestration. But how do I utilize the robots, the bots that I have, for my role, for my account, right? So, and what I'm seeing is that today, if you look at, you have workflow apps like inboxes, common inboxes. You have, digital assistants, right? You have activity feeds, and you have chat apps, right? And where do the bots fit? And by the way, not only these things, and of course you have app screens and dashboards like BI dashboards or like home pages. So you have all these UX things going on. And now people actually try to force you another UX paradigm where you have now to manage all your bots and run your bots and see what the status of your bots. But is it really like a new digital assistant almost, or not?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is something that our good buddy Nunzio is pretty passionate about too.
Mm-hmm.
Is that in the ideal world, I'm presented what I need and want, which is fundamentally the same thing at any point in time. So think of it like a workspace.
Mm-hmm.
How do these things come together based on, again, back to your data sources, based on what that user typically does, and how do we measure success of what they're doing in their daily work, and how do I present that and orchestrate it in a way in the UI that's not necessarily that I'm looking at one particular app screen or I have to go in between all these different things. And this is something the evolving workforce is a whole lot more used to. Because, when you go to your social feeds, it's curated for you based on your history, or dare I say the words, I'm speaking to my wife, right? And then I get an ad for it.
Mm-hmm.
Whoops. But it's all those types of things. Is that coming to the enterprise space? But it's still based on the exact same RPA mindset in that I've got all of this data. Let me orchestrate it to you on the front end of the UI so that I get this curated workspace that's specific to me, my needs, and my organization's needs.
Yeah, but would you like to have a different tool where you go to, if your CIO takes a different vendor and you get a different tool? Or would you like to have it, embedded in your digital assistant or in your inbox, or your feed or your applications, right?
I don't yeah, I certainly wouldn't want another tool. Why would I want another tool for that, right? Like if I've got the core backbone, why would I introduce another complexity that now I've got to figure out how to learn and administer? I don't even think of it in that term, right? I just think of it in terms of end results, and the solution should do that. So
and you would run maybe under a different single sign-on with different roles and security issues that you have to bring together, because at the end you are executing a business process or a portion of it, or portions or some activities of that, and that runs under a certain security. So it's very important that that blending is there from the beginning. It's not something separate.
For me, though, it's what is RPA solving for, right? It's solving for, I don't want to have to do this boring part of my job over and over and over again. It's lost productivity, it's lost labor, it's disengaged workforce. So what we're trying to do is get that off of their plate and get them actually to be more productive and adding value in other parts of the organization, because it's not cheap to hire people. So when I think about interfaces, I don't know if I want another RPA. Like I want an interface for RPA. I want an interface as an administrator for exceptions. When RPA tells me that, hey, we look at these data profiles and this requisition is way out of whack, right? This is worthy of an exception. We need to notify the office of the CFO and someone needs to take an action on it. That's where I want to be able to manage that experience with RPA, because we want to get other people focused on things that actually matter. And there's a reason why we hired people. We need to make them as most productive in the most important critical parts of the organization where we need labor, and we need to automate the things that really just any robot can do. So it's about interfaces that allow me to course correct or influence and enhance and evolve improvement of those models. But it's not necessarily, for me at least, having an RPA interface through a digital assistant, for example, that we have another way to tap into that, right? It's actually about getting people out of that experience and out of that software because it's so boring and tedious. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah. So, but if you say I'm a user, Massimo, and I have a couple of robots in the background running for me, don't you want to know what are they doing? What is the status? If things has been matched or not? So there is something that we want to know what the robots do. Maybe we don't know. We don't want to know, and then everything runs in the background and gets automatically done. But at some point, you don't want to be, going to talk to your boss and say, "Hey, this whole stuff it didn't do or done wrongly, or it's not compliant." Right? You have the chief compliant officer on your table, and so yeah. And my point is, if you do with another tool and not inside your core platform, then it can become like that. That things are maybe not compliant or the decisions are not done in a correct way, and it doesn't really come very convenient to the end user. Although you can go to a tool and quickly define a recording, but then the consuming of those recordings and robots are going to be happening outside the core functionality, right? And the core UX.
Yeah, I definitely think reporting on all of that stuff. Yeah, I mean, I want to know at the very least that I'm paying a vendor and it's doing its job, and I want to see how much value I'm getting out of it, right? But I definitely want to see those types of statistics and that information and productivity. Like, I want to be able to quantify how much time and money I saved in my company by actually implementing a decision, because I want to update my LinkedIn just like everyone else that says I saved $1 million a year.
Yeah, and I'm big on compliance, because in Europe, for instance, it's really, people are really scared about having robots making decision in the background and making good decision, first of all, and compliant decision, right? According to all the laws or whatever that we have in Europe. And so that is why I'm big on this, that if we want to do it in a good way, all the good frameworks in the architectures has to be in place so that you have an RPA solution for the global market and not just for a country that probably works, but doesn't cover all the dimensions.
Yeah, guys, and I think we'll leave the show at this, is that I don't want it to necessarily just be about efficiencies, though. And I know that especially this year, right? The cost savings aspect is so important. But this technology enables so much more opportunity for net new business. We're talking, hey, I should be operating in this area of the country and producing my materials in this sort of way, or using these people over here. I think there's a lot more opportunities to explore a lot of that here in the future. But again, it's on this progression of RPA all the way to IPA to hyperautomation to whatever we're going to call it next, right? And whatever next new marketing term
The
we come out
Terminator.
with. But guys, there we go. Guys, I enjoyed it. I appreciate the time. And for the audience, please remember to check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and especially check us out on YouTube as we do these sort of live recorded shows all the time. Rate and subscribe. And if you've got any feedback or interest on certain topics, let us know. But guys, until next time, enjoyed it.
Yeah, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
See ya.